Afternoon, our guest today. I think we're here to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this topic, and I know many of you over the course of time, well, especially now, let's talk about the time now. I mean, we just dealt with the pandemic. We're dealing with a pandemic, and to enormous proportions in terms of it shows some of the disparities that exist in our communities as it presents itself to access and those different things. And I think we're going to be living with this reality, unfortunately, for some time. Um, what it did was point out the inequities that we all have to deal with every day. I think what we had the opportunity to see during that time too was some of the social injustice that exists. When we watched George Floyd be murdered right before our very eyes during that 8 minutes or so time frame. So we had a chance to really take a look at some of the things that we're all dealing with in our communities in terms of some of the inequities that exist, and including systemic racism. But I know that some of you are saying, man, some of you are confused about the moment. What should I do? What can I do? I'm scared to talk about it. Or why should I be talking about it? I'm in the business of housing. And I get all those things. And I think that that's why it's a complicated situation. It's hard to discuss. And I think that that's why it's so important that we have these conversations, because whether we like it or not, we are forced to deal with these inequities that folks are dealing with every day. And I think, I don't think that anyone should be challenged to try to do the job of being a DEI coordinator. However, if we're going to deal with folks' inequities, we need to understand what they are. And we need to understand, when it pertains to race, what that is when we talk about systemic racism. And we also need to understand what folks in rural communities go through as well. And somewhere in the middle, I think we deal with things in a lot of extremities, including our own industry. We talk about small housing authorities, large housing authorities. And we talk about, we're going to do this to small housing authorities, and then we're going to do this to large housing authorities. And even that within itself can get into this situation where it's an unfair conversation. And so I think that as we approach this topic today, it's important for us to just set the stage and talk about the expectations. I know for myself, I think that as an industry, and I am probably uniquely fit. I think I started my career in dealing with figuring these things out, because many of the families and the folks that I had to work with early in my career, they were dealing with inequities, but many of them didn't look like me. So we had to come up with solutions and understand what was their situations, and whether it be we were dealing with gang alternative programs. So we had to deal with folks that were at risk for dealing with gangs. And we also had to deal with folks that were living in trailer park that were dealing with meth and things of that nature. So I was forced to deal with that. So I understand that I'm a little unique in this space. However, coming up with solutions and understanding what those things are key and paramount as we go through this. So I think what today's session is to help us, give us tools at beginning that process of talking about tools and resources and collaborations that are going to be necessary to address some of these inequities. So I think this is the perfect time to turn it over to Liz, so she can talk to us and introduce what this topic is going to be all about today. And I think everybody here is going to be able to give their piece on why this is important from everybody's vantage point. Because one thing that we don't want to do, we don't want to keep perpetuating the problem that we didn't create, but not come up with solutions in terms of how to deal with it. So Liz?
Thanks, George. I really appreciate that. And for folks who don't know, George Guy is the executive director for the Fort Wayne Housing Authority. He's also president of the NCRC regional chapter of NARO, and he is also the president of the Indiana chapter of NARO. So he's a busy guy, wears a lot of hats. I think sooner or later his head's going to be so big he's going to need one big old grand Guga hat. And I tell you, if anybody can wear it well, it will be George Guy. I'm really delighted with the caliber of folks that we have here today. Angela Belford, Anthony Vasiliou, both who are active in NARO's leadership. Angela chairs the subcommittee on policy for NARO's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee. Anthony, in addition to hitting up his housing authority, he in Connecticut, he is also just a long tenured establishment and Rabble Rouser on the Nominations and Elections Committee for NARO. And he has a distinguished history and a great deal of knowledge about the journey that NARO has been on, particularly I think in the last 20 to 30 years. So it'd be great to hear from him. I wanted to kind of get us started just talking a little bit about equity from a data standpoint. And we can get very emotional about issues around equity and inclusion, and rightfully so. But at the same time, it's really important for us to be grounded in facts and grounded in not just anecdotes and not just what's in the news, but really what the data reveals. And so I want to share with you some charts that I have been pleased to present as a part of some training that I've been doing. And so if you give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about these slides. And they're all about equity. And one of the things that it's important to note is that equity is something that all of us in one way or another are impacted by, whether it's racial inequity or it's income disparity. There are great wealth gaps that exist and persist both in people of color communities, but in low-income communities as well. And when George talks about rural communities, it's important to note that this type of poverty, including suburban poverty, exists throughout our country. And we tend not to think of it in terms of equity, but I want us to think about it in terms of equity, because equity is about fairness and about ensuring equal and equitable and access to wealth, health, education, and then in our case, housing. So bear with me. I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. So I like to call these slides Got Equity. And it's basically just kind of giving you some brief look at how racial and economic inequity creates disparities and restricts access to opportunity. And so starting with the big thing, the racial wealth divide. I think it's important to note that divide has grown over 3 decades. Between 1983 and 2016, the economic disparity, racial economic disparity has really grown. By the middle of the 21st century, that's not that very far away, the United States will be a majority-minority nation. Since 2007, there are more non-white babies being born in the United States than white babies. And that tells us that in, somewhere around 2035, we're going to be looking at a shift in the demography that's important for us to keep in mind as we look at equity and how we might be able to close the persistent wealth divide that's between white households and households of color. It's an issue of social justice, certainly, but it really is an issue of economic viability. And one thing about equity, the more people that we can get engaged in wealth acquisition, the more robust and vital our economy will be. So as with total wealth, homeownership is heavily skewed towards white families. The racial wealth divide shows that. In 2016, 72% of white families owned their homes compared to just 44% of Black families. I can tell you that number has declined even further under COVID. We're now looking at about 41% homeownership amongst Black families. Latino homeownership increased by a dramatic nearly 40%, but it still remains far below the rate for whites at 45%. So you can see these charts indicate the extent of the changes in homeownership or lack thereof. Even worse than the wealth gap is the debt gap or the negative wealth gap. And that means the value of their debts exceeds the value of their assets. These families live on the edge. You know them all too well. There are one minor economic setback from tragedy. Black and Latino families are much more likely to be in this precarious situation. And the proportion of Black families with zero or negative wealth rose by 8.5% to 37% between 1983 and 2016. I'm sure if we looked at even more recent data, particularly given COVID and the enormous job loss that we've experienced, we'd probably see that number even greater.
The proportion of Latino families with zero or negative net worth declined by 19% over the past 30 years, but it is still more than twice as high as the rate for white families. That is important to note. Life expectancy is impacted by whether you're rich or poor. And it's real clear from the data that the very richest income groups live 10 to 15 years longer than the poorest income groups. And you look at life expectancy by gender, clearly women do live a bit longer. But I think it's important to note that the bottom 1%, whether you're male or female, really cuts life short. For women, the difference is about 10 years, which is the equivalent to that of a lifetime of smoking. And men in the top 1% can now expect to live 15 years longer than those in the bottom 1%. So the American Psychological Association published a report which showed that US households with annual incomes below $50,000 a year report higher levels of stress than other families. Average stress levels gradually declined after the 2007-2008 financial crisis, but the stress gap between rich and poor households has been increasing. They're at a crucial stage right now. Blue collar and low income jobs are often more stressful and physically demanding than white collar jobs. This contributes to a variety of other health problems such as high blood pressure, back problems, and diabetes. Societal forces such as discrimination based on race, gender, and sexual orientation add to the stress level of certain population groups. And as you can see, the lower your wealth, the higher your stress level. The bottom third of US earners tend to retire earlier than other Americans as calculated by the Brookings Institution. We clearly know that low-wage workers retire early because of the stressful jobs, and because they cannot claim full retirement benefits before age 66, this trend exacerbates economic inequality among seniors. This is really important to note because you find that low-income folks who don't have wealth in the forms of annuities and savings have to retire early, and therefore it continues to exacerbate their income status.
I love that word, exacerbate.
So according to the APM Research Lab, Black Americans have mortality rates that are more than twice as high as other races, and Indigenous people have significantly higher mortality rates as well. So you can tell from this chart that death rates for Blacks are extremely higher, with Indigenous people coming in at a close second, and whites having the lowest, if you will, mortality rates. So racial justice protests are happening against the backdrop of an economic crisis not seen since the Great Depression. While US billionaires are boosting their fortunes as tens of millions of people are losing their jobs, a Pew Research Center survey shows that Latinx and Black households are being hit with more job losses than white ones. 61% of Latinx households and 44% of Black households have had a job or wage loss due to the pandemic, compared to 38% of white households. And there's some interesting reasons why. The pandemic has forced many workers into remote and telework offices as they've closed around the country, but not everyone has the same ability to work from home. These most recent Bureau of Labor Statistics data on this are from 2017 and 2018, and these pre-pandemic figures indicate that only 19.7% of Blacks and 16.2% of Latinx people work in jobs where they were able to telework, compared to 29.9% of white and 37% of Asian workers. This gap, combined with research documenting that Black and Latinx people now make up disproportionate numbers of jobs deemed essential, explains why people of color have been exposed to greater virus risks. So this really sounds overwhelming and complex, and so what can NARO members do? Now I have this chart up here. I am not going to talk about it because I'm going to then segue over to Angela Belfort, who heads up the policy subcommittee that produced this beautiful infographic But the power behind this graphic is not the intense colors. It's really the reforms, the equity and racial reforms that are proposed in order to give NARO members some skin in this game, because after all, this is bigger than all of us. But at the same time, there are things that we can do as an industry. And so I'd like to turn this over to Angela, talk a little bit about the work of the policy subcommittee and this great infographic that we are now sending around to NARO's leaders to get their buy-in, and to also talk about how we can approach learning, educating, and innovating using these processes. So Angela, my dear, take it away.
Yes, thanks. Just to kind of give you a little background of where the policy subcommittee came from is that we had the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Action Committee, or Advisory Committee, sorry, and I joined it last October. And what you have to know about me is I'm a doer. And so there are a lot of things that I'm not very good at, except doing things. And so I've been on this committee for several months and really got to talking to Liz and said, I want to get some teeth into this. And she agreed to let me, she and some other folks encouraged me to help with this policy subcommittee. I only agreed to do it after some really smart people agreed to join the committee with me. And so we started by asking the question, where do we see discrimination in housing specifically? And we came up with a great list of things, everything from zoning to, and with zoning, things I'd never thought about, like different parts of town where they allow waste treatment plants to be built, or industrial parks, or even in low-income areas not requiring as many trees. So not just the zoning of like allowing dense zoning. We talked a lot about something that's near and dear to my heart is source of income discrimination. There's so many ads that you see on Craigslist that will listings for apartment units that will say, no Section 8 vouchers allowed. And so as we answered those questions, where do we see discrimination? We continued to have really robust conversation. And after a few months, I came back and I said, well, here's what I think that we should fight for. And I had 2 ideas. And I thought they were doable. And Liz said, young lady, we have selected you because you are going to dream big and we want you to be bold. And there was something about that admonition or encouragement, as you will, that really inspired me to kind of swing for the fences. And I took everything that everyone had said in all of our committee meetings and kind of narrowed it down to these 6 areas. So I'll just go over those briefly. In the area of housing, and of course we had to put that top because we are talking about NARO, and we believe that universal housing choice vouchers would solve the affordability issue for many Americans. And there is actually part of the HEROES Act that would provide funding for universal housing choice vouchers, which would mean if you are income qualified, you do get assistance. It would solve affordable housing issues faster than any financing of affordable housing ever could, because it would not only allow the renters to not be rent burdened, but it would also allow our landlords to receive the funding that they need. With that, we would need source of income discrimination so that no one could say no Section 8 vouchers allowed. We think that you should ensure that the FMR rates, that they promote inclusive neighborhoods. If you look at how FMRs are calculated, it seems that their goal is to promote segregation. And hopefully that's an unintended consequence and not something that is intentional, but we think that we need to look at how FMR rates are calculated. I think you should provide consistent zoning requirements, things like trees. If you require it in one part of town, then you should require trees in low-income areas. In the area of homeownership, we think that we should expand HCV homeownership funding. When I talk to other executive directors that are like me, this month is 2 years I've been on this job, many of them aren't exactly sure how homeownership works, but we know that you can do that. And so figuring out how to improve the funding and increase the funding, but then also making sure that housers are aware of how that works and making sure it's accessible. And I know that we could look all the way back to the 50s and redlining, and that feels a little bit daunting and overwhelming. But really specifically, just a very short time ago in our nation's history during the 2008 recession, we know that a lot of people of color lost the wealth that they had begun to increase with the predatory lending that had happened. And so we need to fund homeownership programs that will restore that wealth. We probably need to look into it deeper than that and look back to redlining, but this will be a great start. In the area of criminal justice, this one, I think the reason why I get really passionate and excited about this is because I know that there's a lot of discretion that housing authorities have. So this says to limit the number of years criminal history can be used for housing decisions. You know, if you think about committing a crime and then going into incarceration, and knowing that that felony conviction will stay with you for the rest of your life, it feels very unfair and very inequitable to have a lifetime sentence that is going to make it harder for you to get a job and harder for you to get housing. And so I think that once you've served your time, that we should let people restore their lives. We should consider banning the box, consider only violent felonies and drug manufacture and distribution felonies. These, I believe, are the key felonies that are around the sometimes very well-intentioned housing authority directors say, well, we have to keep our community safe. And so these areas are areas where I feel like that we would be in line with that, but other felonies, I just don't think they should be keeping me from housing. And then the very big broad bucket of criminal justice reform. We over-incarcerate in America, and it is ridiculous. The fact that we are one of the wealthiest nations in the world and we have such a large population of incarceration is absolutely morally wrong. And besides over-incarceration, like once you're a felon, then you have no rights as a citizen. So I think that this whole criminal justice system needs to be reformed. We think. I think that self-sufficiency is important because, as these allude to, the idea is that people need to be able to restore themselves. We need to be able to break the cycle of poverty. And right now we know that there is a very large gap from where you receive assistance and where you can be self-sufficient. So for instance, our community, you receive a lot of services and help if you make about $11 an hour. But if you start making $15 to $17 to $18 an hour, the amount of assistance is dramatically reduced, and you're not really self-sufficient until, especially if you have at least one child, you're not really able to maintain self-sufficiency until you get to about $21 an hour. And so how do we bridge that gap so that we basically right now, our system is designed to reward people for staying on government assistance instead of rewarding them to pursuing self-sufficiency. I think there should be a gentle reduction in dependence on assistance by rewarding earned income. Right now, if you make too much money, you almost instantly lose food stamps. I have a wonderfully smart, intelligent resident, and she says, oh, no, I can't make too much because then I won't be able to feed myself. We need to increase workforce development programs as well. In the area of education options and property tax reform, we need to reassess property tax as the method for funding schools in low-income areas. Someone said, how? I don't know. This is not a how document. This is a what we should go after. But I know that there are states that are figuring this out, and we need to look to those models and find ways that we can close the resource gap for these low-income areas. I think we should expand child care vouchers for working family with either stronger Head Start programs or universal child care vouchers. We know that early childhood education is key to establishing great education experience and not starting kindergarten behind. Finally, we need to, in the area of education, improve our internet and digital access to our low-income areas. In my community, specifically, the They won't even upgrade the infrastructure. So even if somebody has the resources to pay for a faster internet, they just have determined it's not really worth it for them. And finally, this area of access to resources in low-income areas, we begin to imagine this as a scorecard for development funding. So if you can imagine things like LIHTC or other affordable housing funding that would ask whether or not a new affordable housing project has access to healthy food, dental, or medical services. Should we look at medical and dental clinics being co-located with schools with high rates of free and reduced lunch, or even co-located with affordable housing projects? So you can see that I took Liz's encouragement to be bold very seriously, and our policy committee has continued to hone this, and we look forward to seeing how this can bear fruit nationally.
I have to say, I had a sneak peek of that a couple of days ago. I saw Betsy, and she gave me a sneak peek of that. And the work that you all are doing is outstanding. Angela, that's just amazing. And Liz has these big ideas and this vision, and I just think that's awesome. And I think one of the things you said was important, it goes back to what I said before, is that, you know, some of us are thought leaders, right? So what we got to do now is figure out how do we make all this stuff happen. It's a lot of heavy lifting. We got to change a system that has been this way for many, many decades. And if we're telling the truth about it, it was designed, it was designed with a lot of economic inequities. But then when race was put in, then it was designed to segregate and be unfair to those people of color. So that's why it's a big problem, and it's complex when we take a look at it. So, but in the spirit of equity and how much equity matters, these things have to happen. So there's a balance, a fairness amongst our communities. So, and I know this is a good segue into what I know my colleague peer, Anthony Vasillo, always talks about in terms of some of the challenges that as an industry, if we don't start to deal with, he's concerned that, you know, we could be facing some major problems from the residents and our customer base. So I'm gonna turn it over to Anthony and let him talk about his perspective on this.
Well, thank you, George. I have to tell everyone on the committee, and I know we have some participants from Texas, the Texas State chapter, that I really love this committee, and I'm not a member on the committee. I almost said maybe I should appoint myself as the regional president. And that's because it's extremely provocative and it's thought-provoking, and that appeals to me greatly. I always have looked at life that way and tried not to close myself off. And I will tell you, as you get older, you have to fight that, because sometimes you become a little set in your ways, and you have to always be open and solicitous of good ideas and new thoughts and younger people who come into the process. So this is a great group, and I enjoy it. But and I appreciate always the camaraderie that I find on the committee, and thank you all for that. And thank you, Texas, for inviting us. One thing I'll go quickly through this, and we have a little bit more time than we did in our summer session. But I do want to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Milford Redevelopment Housing Partnership, which I've been here for over 24 years, or as the regional president for the New England Regional Council. So I'm speaking, these are my opinions and my thoughts, and my objective is to really stir the pot, get people to think about things. And one of the items that I've walked away with is that when I hear people talk about this subject, it really varies tremendously across the landscape. So, you know, we have in Connecticut many rules and laws and regulations that protect people. So there is no income exclusion. It's a constitutional protection in the state of Connecticut that you cannot use income as a source to determine residency. And other states are still trying to get that through. We've had that on the books for a long time. So it does vary. So I'm going to try to bring down a few numbers from Texas and a little bit from Connecticut, some thought in my own state. And I am going to focus mostly on zoning. And I have been a zoning and planning commissioner for 10 years in a very diverse community where I was brought up in Connecticut, Middletown, Connecticut. And so I want to bring some of my ideas and combine them with things that I've learned in the housing industry over the last 24 years. First, I'll repeat this for the Texas participants in today's Zoom meeting. There's some fundamental concepts that I will springboard from. So I will read these so that they're not misunderstood. Housing policies and practices have a disparate impact on communities we serve, resulting in unacceptable segregation in our state's communities, census tracts, and neighborhoods. A second fundamental concept that I want to talk about is continued support for existing funding and proposed increases will exacerbate segregated housing in our nation. And third is that NARAL must challenge the status quo, develop new concepts based on verified data and not anecdotal information, and shift the paradigm on how we provide deeply subsidized housing in America. So those are my three fundamentals, and I'm going to focus in on zoning. I will say that I believe that to be that zoning revisions as a solution to segregated housing is somewhat of a false premise and impractical to achieve. And there's a number of reasons for that. For instance, there's way too many planning commissions, zoning boards, boards of appeals to provide meaningful reform. Now you got to remember that we're talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of these entities all across the country that permeate our states. And in a place like Connecticut, we have 106 communities, legal jurisdictions, and all of them have some kind of a zoning planning agency or zoning board of appeals. And I know the laws vary from state to state, so I can only be an expert in what I know in Connecticut. And we only have maybe about 3,100 housing authorities, PHAs, and even some administrators in Section 8 program because they're only Section 8 administrators. So I think that it's always frustrating to try to make a change if we don't have control of it. And housing authorities have too little footprint and influence in most communities to make meaningful changes. Now, I know that in the Connecticut marketplace in New England, we have huge amounts of segregation. It really bothers me that we have that, and that a lot of the push for what we should do are coming from the development community, the nonprofit development community, not necessarily from public housings. We don't resist it, but it's not being pushed because we have to operate within the zoning codes and some good, very good state statutes, and I'll come back to that. We have a lot of politics to overcome. I've always, and I said this to the Public Housing Committee, which I've been a member on maybe for 17 or 18 years consecutively, as I once made this statement and I said, why do we have commissioners? And I mean, it would just reverberate outside the room, down to the bar, down into the lobby areas, because people thought I wanted to get rid of the Commissioners Committee. Well, I didn't want to get rid of the Commissioners Committee, but we all know that they are political appointees. It depends from state to state. Sometimes governors have a role in appointing people like they do in Massachusetts. In Connecticut, it's done by the mayor with or without the consent of the legislative body, the Aldermanic Council. So it varies how people become commissioners, but they are supposed to be politically oriented. And they're political in part because of who appoints them and why they're appointed. And if you really get down and talk to a lot of executive directors, they're somewhat bothered by that. Now we go over to the development side, the nonprofit development side, they have boards of directors. They're not political, they're experts. They have the expertise in taxing and accounting and law. And if you put together nonprofit development corporations, they're not hamstrung in bringing in the talent they need, the vision they need to make changes. Public housing authorities, I think, are hamstrung by the requirement that commissioners be appointed. Now, we all know the history of that was to make them closer to the communities that they serve and to reflect the values that they serve. And if you do an annual agency plan every year, what do you have to do? The chief executive officer has to sign off that the city's plan of development is not conflicting or is consistent with the annual agency plan of your agency. And if you have a federal agency and federal properties, you've got to do that. But so the politics is huge. And, you know, I think one reform that you have to think about is how we operate versus how nonprofits operate that do development in our communities and in our states across the country. And they don't have some of the political side of the business as we do that we have to contend with. I want to talk a little bit about how Connecticut has instituted, I think, some very vibrant reforms, but how they've not been successful. And, you know, these reforms get talked about all the time. So here's a reform, it's a big one. Back in 1989, there was a Blue Ribbon Commission that dealt with the lack of affordable housing. Okay, so that's 30 years ago. And they developed what was supposed to be a very important statute, and it's known in Connecticut as 8-30G. That's actually a statutory reference. And essentially what it did is it said that if a community did not meet or exceed 10% of the housing stock to meet the state definition of affordable housing, that any developer could come into town and put an application in and essentially flip the roles of the planning and zoning commission and the developer. Normally in land management and land development in most of our communities, public housing, not public, planning and zoning commissions act in a legislative capacity. So what would happen is that they would call the shots, and the applicant had the burden of saying why they needed to do this development or had to ask for a waiver or a special exception or whatever. In Connecticut, if your community is under 10% of the housing stock that meets the affordability definition of the state of Connecticut, it reverses. And it's almost impossible to stop a developer from coming into town to develop housing because the burden of proof switches over, and the courts have consistently held that a reasonable plan that's proposed by a developer can come in and provide affordable housing options. You'd say that's wonderful. Now, this law was adopted and came into place July 1st, 1990. So we've been 30 years.
Anthony, can I ask you
Go
a
ahead.
question?
Yes, sir.
How has that impacted your state as well as your community in terms of this question we're talking about in terms of inclusion and equity and all that?
Yeah, well, let me tell you, very little. That's the problem. You see, George, it didn't work, even though it was supposed to be, you know, theoretically, if you have affordable housing and you look at extremely low income and low income families, which we serve principally, that those groups are represented by high percentages of not only people that make low incomes, but people that are protected classes. Now, of course, in Connecticut, we have 13 protected classes. Federally, you only have 7. So we have 13. So we look at almost double the number of people that are impacted in Connecticut for it. And the irony is that, you know, I looked at the numbers from 2002 to 2019, in 17 years, we are actually in reverse. So in Milford, where I am, no matter what I've tried to do or how much of a development's gone on under the statute, we actually fell from 5.92% of the housing stock in Milford meets the affordability definition of the state to 5.31. And what's really sad is that out of 169 communities, 106 which have public housing authorities in Connecticut, even though the statute was well intended, actually from 2002 to 2019, we've lost a community. Only 30 communities meet or exceed 10% of the housing stock. And that means things that are done with tax credits. That means things that are done with subsidies, mobile homes. I mean, there's actually 4 categories that are used. And this is a meticulous report put together every single year by every community, sent to the state and groomed. So we went from 31 to 30 communities. This is not a good track record in the state of Connecticut, although well-intended. Now, let me talk a little bit about Texas and how Section 8 plays into this. Because public housing and development really deals with a fixed unit of housing that is intended to serve individuals at a certain income point, be extremely low income or low income housing. So I looked at Texas, for instance, And it's fascinating. Texas has about 44,400 units of public housing, and they have 169,561 units of Section 8. So it's about an 80-20 split. Now, on the East Coast, it's not as varied as that, but as you sweep across the country and you look at the Section 8 program, what happens is that you can get easy 80% of the affordable housing is Section 8 based, and very little is what I call land based, that is where you build it. So again, when we talk about inclusionary zoning or all these ideas that the zoning codes are having an ill effect on housing opportunities, affordable housing opportunities, we're not developing housing, or public housing is not growing. In fact, it's shrunk 300,000 units since 1999. To date, we've lost 300,000 public housing units due to, quote, repositioning. So my point is that if I get into the Section 8 program, where people have choice, I believe that vouchers and choices of where to live are not quite as encumbered as public housing by plans of development and zoning ordinances. But that's what we talk about. What we should be talking about is the bigger program. I mean, even National Narrow said they want to put over $90 billion into new Section 8 vouchers. That is a position that's been taken by the organization. 90 billion. I mean, I'm sitting down saying, we got 74 billion in arrears and deferred maintenance. Why don't we take care of that problem and at least prop up that part of the industry? But no, we'll go do Section 8. If that 90 billion became reality, where do you think that's all going to go? It's going to follow the same course like a river does for thousands or tens of thousands of years. We're just going to keep going down the same roads that have led to huge amounts of segregation, including where people have taken their Section 8 vouchers in the communities and neighborhoods and census tracts that they put them in. Or large housing authorities will continue to attract people to urban areas or the inner cities and continue to exacerbate an existing bad problem of segregation. While communities like myself, which are communities of opportunity, I need those resources. I need to be able to have the ability of being able to have Section 8 vouchers that go to strictly to communities of opportunity. So we can add more housing opportunities, affordable housing opportunities in places like Milford, Connecticut, and a lot of small, medium-sized communities, and not just keep packing them in and then saying we're doing a great job. And the big battle that goes on, in my mind, is that you can serve a lot of people. We use head counts and number of households, and number of people that we're housing, and we really kind of ignore the quality of their life. And I really feel strongly that a lot of communities like Milford and others across the country can provide great education opportunities, safe communities, recreational opportunities, social services that can really help individuals raise kids and bring up a different generation who will seek educational opportunities and break the cycle and dependency of looking for subsidies, or to give them the skills that they need to be successful in a very advanced economy like the United States of America. So again, that's kind of my presentation a little bit, and some of the things I challenge. And I hope this committee and Texas chapter starts asking similar questions or other questions and starts conversations about this. And I've said that I've been trying for years to get the housing committee to take on these discussions. And I've asked Liz and this committee to maybe weigh in a little bit and participate, because I do think we need to look at this and across this country. Anyway, I've used up some time. Thank you very much, Liz and the panel, for listening to me. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Anthony, as usual, thank you for your candor and for your insight. And I think you're onto something, particularly in terms of zoning and land use policy. This is something that I think as part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion's Advisory Committee's charter and mission is to create a online content delivery approach that will provide the kind of education and inspiration, frankly, for our membership, in which we provide some grounding and information around issues like land use policy and zoning, because it's critical, and it has been the way that has further ingrained these the segregated land use patterns that we find throughout the country. And so we have launched, or we will be launching soon, a new version of Club 21, Educate, Innovate, Elevate, Act. And the purpose of that is to provide access on a regular basis to educational and inspirational materials to help our membership gain the knowledge and the skills that they need in this world where we are focusing on increasing equity and inclusion in the work that we are doing, both in our industry and in our communities. We want to also be the leading examples of how equity can be fostered within our industry, while at the same time trying to act locally to ensure that we have more inclusive and equitable communities. And so when we launch Educate, Innovate, Elevate, Act, we are hoping that many of our members will take advantage of the offerings that we will provide. And part of that will be taking the public policy reforms that we're recommending, and then putting them in the form, putting those reforms in the form of a syllabus of learning, so that we can then have a constructed and deliberate and intentional approach to exposing our members to issues around land use and zoning. And you'll see that two of the recommendations that we've talked about definitely has been around source of income discrimination, and as well inclusionary zoning ordinances, which provide set-asides in developments of any particular size. Some jurisdictions say that you have to do it if you build at least 50 units, you have to set aside 10 to 15% of your units as affordable. We see that as certainly a practice that can be adopted locally. But one of the things, as a national organization, NARA wants to be on the side of advocating for national strategies that can be implemented locally. And we recognize that all communities are not equal. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory standpoint, but we all have different nuances about our communities, whether they're rural, urban, suburban, small, large, in access to proximity to an urban area that may have the kinds of resources that may be needed or not. And we have communities that are homogenous. We have communities that are racially diverse. We have communities that are economically diverse. But one thing we all have in common is that we are all serving low-income families and households. And we know that they are the ones, based on the data that's out there, they're the ones who have shortened lives, more stressful lives. They're more susceptible to disease. They're more susceptible to violence. They are sorely lacking in wealth, and quite truthfully, sometimes in some ways, even though we intend and we are intentional about providing safe and decent housing for our families, in some ways, though, we are holding them back, and we are not helping our best families gain the equity and access to wealth that they deserve. So while we enjoy them paying their rent on time every month, I think that they could probably be paying a mortgage payment on time every month. And so, we've also advocated for expanded use of Section 8 for home ownership. And in doing that, we also recognize that we need lending partners that will be able to companion that Section 8 housing choice voucher, so that we can ensure that we can use our resources to really not only gain equity in terms of fairness in the ways that people live, including access in healthcare, but also in being able to position them to break the cycle of multi-generational poverty. And as home ownership is the one critical element that most American families have their wealth is based on, if we can pursue that and we can promote that, while at the same time building viable rental communities to provide people who are vulnerable, who are housed poorly, with the opportunity to live in safe, decent communities, we will be doing more than just providing shelter. We will be positioning people for a viable, sustainable future. So I really appreciate the comments, and particularly about land use and zoning. But I think we'd also like to hear from some of the other folks. I'm going to turn this back over to George, and I am grateful for his leadership all the time.
No, Liz, you are outstanding, and I want to echo what you said, Anthony. I think what he gets to is how different this looks in different states. It's some states have have those type of restrictions, and some states don't. Some states recognize some of the inequities that exist, and they're trying to get that equity. I know places like Virginia where they have the Housing Trust Fund, where folks, when they're talking about development, they can there's money set aside for housing authorities to do development, and so they have all these intricacies in terms of how to deal with it. But I do think that what Liz and DEI and under her leadership and Angela, what they're working on is really dynamic, because I think it's going to really help us as housing authorities or PHAs in our communities to help advance housing, but also other economic opportunities that are important too. We can't deny that there's been a lack of investment in these communities. And for the life of me, I don't understand why, we know why it happened or why it exists, but now that we know, we haven't done much to take care of it. So I think, like I said, the actions that are taking, the experiences that folks are having, all these things being synthesized, I think are going to really allow us, the thought leaders, to really come up with some solutions and the right, and I'm going, dare I say this, the right reforms to deal with this. And I think that what's going to happen is PHAs are going to become more relevant in our communities, because we're going to be able to be at the table and maybe take some leadership in those areas. And I know some of housing authorities are doing this now in their communities, but it's a tough conversation to have if you're having it alone. And that's why the industry then has to get behind this. And I said it from the beginning of the conversation, is that I know some folks are saying, listen, I'm not a DEI expert. And that's why we have Liz, right? And so you don't have to be the expert, but with the way that DEI is going, there's going to be a bucket of resources and tools that are going to help NARO facilitate this, hopefully, to the membership. And if you're interested in getting to know and getting to understand and learn, then you can join the group, and you can have a better understanding. I don't think anybody here necessarily went. I don't think most of us probably went to school and said we're going to be housing directors or housing whatever. I think we just landed here because of one thing. I think that we were interested in humanity. And if we're interested in humanity, we have to be interested in equity, because equity matters across the board, okay? When we're talking about housing, if you are saying, hey, I'm in the business of doing housing, well, you can't talk about housing unless you talk about equity. From our own homes into the homes that we manage and own. There has to be a certain amount of equity, and when it pertains to housing. And then when when you think about that, you got to think about the larger community and what's involved in the community. Because if where an individual lives determines how their life is going to eventually turn out, then we're going to need a certain amount of equity. Because if we don't want that to, if I can track somebody by where they come and whether they're going to go to prison or become successful in life, we have a problem. If we want to reduce the crime, then we got to make sure that it's like Liz said from the beginning, there should be some fairness as it pertains to dealing with these communities that are disproportionately and has been disenfranchised. So equity matters. No matter where we're at in our lives, and no matter what color you are, no matter what gender you are, no matter if you're in a small housing authority, a large housing authority, equity matters. And that's why this topic is so important to me. It's so close to me. It's a part of what we do, whether we like it or not. You do not have to be the diversity expert. Most of us are not. However, you do have to understand that there's inequities that exist. You work with them every day. So we have to be solution focused as we go forward. So we do have some guests here. Any feedback from our Carrie and James? Carrie, James? I don't think Carrie and James will.
You can hear us. You guys are muted.
I think they're muted.
Well,
I mean, they have to unmute themselves.
I will never leave a mic unused as long as I can get on the soapbox. And because this is stuff that I'm passionate about, and I think that's what draws, as George said, most of us did not go to school to become housing authority leaders. But this is something that we are passionate about, and when we talk about humanity, we talk about equity. But come on, the elemental urge that's underlying all of this is the value of love for our communities, love for humanity, and love for a society that protects and nurtures its own. And I think that there's a lot of folks who have had some real challenges, and we've had people that have, sought the need for healing and sought the need for forgiveness. And one of the things that we can't get to any of that if we're not willing to talk about it. And if we truly, truly believe that the work that we're doing really saves lives and protects lives and nurtures lives, then in doing all of that, we also have to have the desire, the overwhelming desire to deal with the hard stuff and have those conversations and to fight for fairness. And while sometimes it may not be politically popular, it may be challenging, you might have to climb some really rough hills. But at the same time, I'm mindful of folks like John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and my own Congressman Elijah Cummings, and people who talk about, fighting for the things that you care about, getting in necessary good trouble when you take a stand. And also, when you know better, do better. And one of the things we hope to launch in the first, if you will, content that we deliver for the Educate, Innovate, Elevate Act is a history of public housing. And I think that one of the things that we all need to ground ourselves is, how did we start? Because a lot of people don't understand the nature of what enabled public housing, how it used the neighborhood composition rule to reinforce segregation, and how those patterns were reinforced through systematic zoning practices and policies. And so once we start grounding ourselves in that knowledge and that education, we can begin to elevate the conversation around the role that public housing has played in segregating families, low income, people of color, et cetera, and then look at what steps we need to take in order to dismantle a system that is inherently unhealthy for people who are in some ways forced to be isolated and live in poverty. I think that I'm hopeful, because these conversations that we've had over the last several months indicate that people are interested in these issues, that they are operating out of a compassionate nature. But we also have some really talented, thoughtful, and creative people who are thinking through this process. One of the things we know for sure as housers, we need partners. We need partners to help us in the work. So it's not just enough that we are knowledgeable, and as we prepare and train ourselves and educate ourselves, we also have to reach our hands out and create bridges into the community, into the institutions that can also help support the work that we're doing. So we need partnerships with lenders, with universities, with healthcare institutions, with foundations and nonprofit organizations to help leverage the resources that we need to bring into our communities, because we can't do it alone and we can't expect government to do it. I will tell you, one of the things I'm bringing up, and that I'm hoping that some of our colleagues will embrace, is the notion of pushing for a national housing strategy. Our neighbor to the north, Canada, embarked upon developing a national housing strategy a few years ago, and they're enjoying some success. We don't have a national housing strategy. We have HUD, and HUD dictates and regulates and promulgates, but what they don't do is encourage a national housing strategy that speaks to the values that I know most of us embrace. And so as we go through this process and we use diversity, equity, and inclusion to help educate and elevate this discussion, what we're hoping to do is to recruit folks to be moderators, to be discussion leaders, to be thought leaders, and to embark upon this learning process, and at the same time be a teacher. And so I loved giving the example of Angela Belford, who professes to not knowing much, but in her saying that, she reveals that she knows enough to say, I don't know everything, but I do know what I need to learn. And once you take that upon yourself, you are already 90% towards achieving your goal. And so I welcome more Angelas, and I welcome more Anthonys who become a provocateur, and I embrace the leadership of George Guy. And I say that with great passion and great respect. And I have respect for both Angela and Anthony, and I think that they have provided a remarkable level of conversation in a conversation that has been long overdue. And I'm grateful that we are engaging in meaningful and principled conversation even while we tackle some really tough issues.
Can I, Elizabeth, just add a little history? You did mention that, and I do have a little history here. Because it's Texas, Texas knows that a immediate past president of the organization was from Austin, Texas, and Carl Ritchie is a good friend of mine, and I think he is one of the stunningly great presidents that the national organization has had in my career. And I've seen a lot of executive directors go through NARO, and I've also seen a lot of presidents and vice presidents go through, and Carl was one of the better of them. And what I did is that when Elizabeth asked me to participate, I did a little research here. And, you know, since 1933, when NARO was formed, there have been 5 individuals that have been African-American descent. And the first was in 1972. And why this is important to me is because there was early adoption by this organization of doing things and opening doors. And that history has to continue forward, and if anything, accelerate during this discussion that we're taking today, and that this committee that's chaired by Liz is trying to spark these conversations and this movement within NARO and maybe outside of our organization into the communities that we serve. And interestingly, in 81 and 83, there was actually a contest for senior vice presidents. And a gentleman won that contest, a gentleman named R. Clayton Jones from Pontiac, Michigan. And he actually beat another African-American for that senior vice president's position out of San Francisco, California. So we've actually had some competition. So we've had people from Oakland, California, Pontiac, Michigan, Omaha, Opelika, Alabama, and Austin, Texas. And again, to me, I think these individuals paved the way, set a good example, and showed that NARO has been for a long time trying to do the right thing and open up itself and to allow individuals that had been shut out, both in gender, both in color, both in belief systems, religious belief systems, both in familiar status, sexual orientations. And I think it's wonderful to be involved with a group of people like that who are so dedicated and passionate to housing other people who generally are much less fortunate than we are in this group, and the people who serve as executive directors and employees around the country and the over 3,100 PHAs. It's a great group to be with. It really is. And sometimes we don't look at that history that we have and the kind of organization. I'm going to tell you, it's changed in my tenure, and I don't go back that long, I don't think, but I guess I'm one of the older people still around on the Board of Governors, maybe the oldest now. But the bottom line is that I've seen this change. It's all for the good. And so, you know, to Angela and George and to Liz and the rest of the members of the committee, Sangor, who I participated with here, and Peter, who wasn't able to join us in the earlier conversation, I really hope this next generation takes off and continues and makes it even a more vibrant organization, a more diverse organization, a more inclusive organization, and is able to get it outside of our confines into our communities and to other communities that we serve or touch in providing housing opportunities to people throughout the country. So a little history there, I thought, and I'm very proud of being in this organization because of that.
Good.
George,
Anthony,
you want to bring us home?
what's that? I'm sorry.
You going to bring us home?
Well,
Yeah.
I think with Anthony's closing words and your closing words, I think that's enough. They won't hear much more from me. I do want to turn, if we could, our people, and I want to thank Texas NARO. I did a presentation here 2 years ago. You guys have the best hospitality. I wish we could be there doing it right now. Best hospitality, the best barbecue. And
Oh, well,
everything.
yeah.
So it's all good. So, but I do think it's important, Liz, if real quick, if we can just let Liz plug our DEI, I think that is critical for the folks that are on the call right now, so they can understand the work that's being done and how they can join.
Mhm.
Great. So first of all, membership on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee is by presidential appointment. And so if you're interested, by all means, please talk to either your regional president or your state president. But what I want to tell you about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that we are an advisory committee that's focused on developing a framework of equity and inclusion for the NARO membership, and hopefully provide them with the tools and the education and the inspiration to be able to infuse equity and inclusion both in their local work and in their regional and state work. Through our Educate, Elevate, our Educate, Innovate, Elevate Act, i.e. Club 21, we're going to have monthly content delivery. We're going to push out their films, books, podcasts, articles, lectures, etc., so that we can avail our members of this timely information. We will also be training people to moderate monthly discussions around the topics and around the film and the content that we push out there. We're recruiting. We would love folks to be engaged in that work. We would also like folks to be engaged in the subcommittee work that's also underway. Angela chairs the subcommittee on policy. We will have a new committee that we're announcing next week on partnerships. We hope to get some new members for that committee, which will focus on developing those institutional and community partnerships, which are essential to the success of our communities. But importantly, we are having discussions with our national leaders, our strategic planning, which we think will be a critical vehicle to roll out these policy reforms. We're talking to national standing committees. So we've been meeting with the National Housing Committee. We've met with the Commissioners Committee. We've met with state chapters, regional chapters, and we have had some incredible conversations. We want you to be a part of those conversations. And we would love to come back when you have a...
For just your vulnerability and your honesty.
I'm hoping that we will be able to come back. While this is a small audience, it's a mighty audience. And one thing I know for sure, if each one of us reach one other person, we will go a long way towards recruiting, and if you will, a cadre of experts. We'll all learn together. So I'm very graciously appreciative of being able to be here with you today. And I want